Excellency, as we celebrate with you, one of the things about the Sharpeville massacre and the whole evolution of the anti-apartheid movement and eventual liberation of South Africa. In so many ways, the apartheid system mirrored the colonial effects post-slavery in so many countries, such as the Jim Crow laws of the United States, and even subtle practices that became a norm in West Indian communities and in Caribbean countries. But what was also enlightening was that following South Africa's liberation, they convened a Commission for Truth and Reconciliation 4 years after in 1998. And I cannot fail but to mention that in some ways, and maybe in many ways, this is what gave us in the Caribbean the impetus to start talking boldly about reparations ourselves and to start forming committees for reparations in the different CARICOM islands and here in Jamaica, where that committee has evolved to become a national council on reparations. In many ways, South Africa set an example that following so many years of trauma, so many years of brutal laws, unfair laws, massacres, that it wasn't enough to just say, well, we are free now and let's move on. And that some redress had to be done. Some consideration had to be given for the healing and for the psychological welfare of a nation that suffers under that form of discrimination brutally. As Ambassador Yangeni said, it's also fitting that in this month of March here in Jamaica, as we recognize Women's History Month, is also a day where we are talking about Human Rights Day in South Africa, or even the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, really, which was established to mark the anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre. Women are very important. In fact, they are the building blocks of the nations. And not only must we consider the tremendous role that they played in the liberation of South Africa, but even our own experience here in Jamaica with our heroines going back to Nana of the Maroons and others, it must be recognized how important their welfare and their strength is in liberating nations. As we wait to be joined shortly by our South African speakers, I do want to invite our chair, another example of strong womanhood in this country, Chair of the National Council on Reparation, Mrs. Lalita Davis, who will be reading a message from our own minister, the Honorable Olivia Babsy Grange, Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, who was recently recognized by the Crown Council of Ethiopia for her work and her advocacy in building closer relations between Jamaica and our African brothers and sisters throughout the various nations of that continent. And so today is also a special day, and we want to thank the Minister for lending her support to this event. It goes a long way in recognizing the long history and synergy between South Africa and Jamaica and the fact that we are stronger together. So please welcome Mrs. Davis Mattis, Chair of the National Council on Reparation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Our own member of our National Council, Mr. Stephen Golding, and is also here in his capacity as leader of that August group. We also wish to mention Her Excellency Ambassador Lumka Yengeni, the South African High Commissioner to Jamaica, Dr. Muki Moyeng, I hope I'm pronouncing these words correctly, Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor of the Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Lunga Mantashe, Convocation President of the Walter Silus University of South Africa, our guests, and Mr. Selinga, First Secretary, Political. It is my pleasure to read the Minister's statement to us today. And she says, "Today, I am pleased to share this space with my brothers and sisters from the Republic of South Africa in a unified repudiation of discrimination in all forms. Indeed, the government and people of Jamaica stretch forth our hands in solidarity with the government and people of South Africa through Her Excellency, Ambassador Lumka Yengeni, in the enduring fight to rid the world of the scourge of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Today, March the 21st, the world pauses to reflect and once more pledge to eradicate all vestiges of domination by race on this United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That this day was declared by the United Nations as part of the effort to combat racism and racial discrimination as far back as 1966, the year His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie came on a pilgrimage to Jamaica, and that event is well worth our pause and reckoning. What could have been happening in 1966 to make this world's august body in promotion of world peace take such a stance? After all, slavery and the slave trade had been abolished centuries before through the relentless efforts of the enslaved. 6 years before that, in 1960, on March the 21st, 69 people were brutally executed and over 180 injured at the hands of the police in what became known as the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa. Among the dead were 29 children, some even shot in the back as they fled in panic. Many of us gathered here today may not remember or even know of these moments in our history when the tide rises to monumental proportions and human destiny is fashioned out of catastrophe and toxic relationships. It was in homage to those who sacrificed their lives for the right to live, who gave their lives for the right to be, that we honor today as we come together here at the South African High Commission. We cannot make them, the multitude of the enslaved, die in vain. I invite us to pause for 30 seconds of silence on behalf of those who, through the Sharpeville incident, chilled the world even a bit. Thank you. History reminds us of another signal moment in the history of global efforts to rid the world of the scourge of racism. The occasion was in October 1963 when His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie stood before the United Nations and said, "Until the philosophy that holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, that until the color of a man's skin is no more significant than the color of his eyes, that until basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all, without regard to race, that until that day, the dream of lasting peace and world citizenship and the rule of international morality will remain but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained." Today, 60 years and many movements and stratagems after, can we say that His Imperial Majesty's projection is any less formidable than when it was first asserted? It is interesting that this year's commemoration of this International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination occurs on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That body of codes which nations have signed onto, and which for many is still lip service. Today we stand on the cusp of the end of the International Decade of People of African Descent, with its enduring, seemingly unattainable theme of justice, recognition, and development. Like His Imperial Majesty, we too can speak of some achievements, but for many, it is still justice deferred, recognition denied, and development thwarted. The truth is, there is need for a more dynamic, protracted, and restorative agenda for the elimination of racial discrimination. The fact is, if the turbulences and confrontations today are any indication of where we are far from that goal of eliminating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Our ancestors were among the most brutally devalued, vilified, and denigrated on the basis of their race. In fact, the horrible atrocity of capture, trafficking, and forcible removal of Africans from their homeland, transshipped, auctioned, and transplanted as property, and chattelized into enslavement on plantations in Jamaica, the Caribbean, and the Americas, has been responsible for the entrenchment of racism and racial discrimination within systems of national and international governance to this day. In 2001, gathered in Durban, South Africa, once more, as a testament to the final upending of the racialized system of apartheid, the United Nations made a positive step of declaring slavery and the transatlantic slave trade a crime against humanity. It is noteworthy that the Durban Declaration and action noted with grave concern that despite the efforts of the international community, the principal objectives of the 3 decades to combat racism and racial discrimination have not been attained, and that countless human beings continue to the present day to be victims of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Among the observances was that Africans and Africans' descendants and Asians continue to represent the grouping more likely to be more racially profiled and discriminated against, demonstrating the systemic racism inherent in slavery and colonialism, and which still govern and influence global economic and political systems. Today, Jamaica stands resolute that the unfair and unfortunate racial profiling and harassment of our ancestors must be treated with. Today, the need to repair the damage occasioned by the enslavement and colonialism of our people must be promoted at all costs. We affirm reparations now. The National Council of Reparations has launched out on a sectoral deliberation regarding the pathway to reparations within the education sector. Curriculum officers and the leadership of schools and regions have concurred on the challenge to attain optimal levels of educational achievement because of inadequacy in funding the full educational needs of our children. This has implications for the telling of our own stories and the creation of profiles of our children at various stages of educational development. We also know that more private companies and corporate bodies, including churches and universities, are discussing formats for reparation. For example, the Churches Subcommittee of the National Council on Reparation is actively engaged in the promotion of reparation within and among our churches. In fact, a United Caribbean delegation was able recently to include the topic of reparations on the agenda of the most recent meeting of the World Council of Churches in Germany. Further to this are the public consultations which we have held over the years with the wider public that have sought to respond to toxicity within social relationships that often erupt in violence within families, relationships, and communities. This causes us to pause and register the reality of mental slavery as depicted within the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey. Though others may free the body, none but ourselves can free our minds. We are all very familiar with that. It has been widely discussed that the frontiers of the mind have been the location of the most enduring impact of slavery and colonialism. Many of our people have inherited fractured identities, characterized by limitations in development postures and inferiority complexes, manifesting itself in social deficits as bleaching, violence, and crime. For us, remediation and reparation on the part of the perpetrators are both steps on the road to redemption. Of course, it must be stated that our racialized structures by colonial practice have also been responsible for the re-enfranchisement of our people, which have manifested in creations such as reggae music and the development of one of the world's greatest brands. This may be seen as built from the litanies of resistance, revolt, and open war waged by our ancestors throughout the period of enslavement. It was a people unwilling to forget their ancestral pedigree, whose military and other prowess in their homeland became the stuff of their heroic stance against racial profiling. Throughout the creations of African retentions and the telling of our stories through music, texts, and images became the forte of the new Jamaica, so much that we can boast of having taken on the leadership of a country for which we were originally viewed as unworthy. Re-enfranchisement in these conditions came to a system that centralized Africa within the framework of Jamaican culture and society, within which such elements such as Rastafari, marinage, revivalism, intuitiveness, and a host of new creations became the centerpiece of the modern Jamaica, which, in the word of Garvey, continues to astonish the world. Today, we at the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport are even more determined to use the potency of the portfolio cited to reinforce the natural mystic that we are and continue to defy human understanding. Yet in all this, we must double our efforts to eliminate all vestiges of racism and racial discrimination that may remain between, within, and among us. We must be prepared to create a new society in which equal rights and justice are foundational to daily life and existence, where our children feel protected and assured of their right to be, regardless of their race, where every man and woman have an equal right to live and be free, and where there are no limits that may define the contours of our being, but rather have our being fashioned by unlimited power, by the God Almighty we serve. Today, we redouble our efforts in the fight to eliminate racial discrimination and reduce the discriminated, yet does not eliminate the prejudice. The right to live free from fear and discrimination is a human right to be protected, promoted. It is our hope and desire to work closely with the United Nations, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and all United Nations systems in furtherance of our goal to eliminate racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, related intolerance in all its forms. And we say, we press on in the philosophy of Nelson Mandela, who guides us that to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. No retreat, no surrender. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Lalita Davis Mathis is also General Counsel for our University of the West Indies. That message came to us from our own Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports, the Honorable Olivia Babsy Grange. The occasion again being the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Human Rights Day in South Africa. And we're going to go now to South Africa to hear from our distinguished guest today, who will have 10 minutes to give their remarks. We're going to begin with Dr. Mookie Moeng, who is the Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching at Nelson Mandela University. She is a past student of Nelson Mandela University, where she served as Senate Representative. She's also a former Institutional Director of Teaching and Learning at the Northwest University in South Africa. And what's interesting is, Dr. Moeng did a thesis on democracy in education, where she examined the apartheid curriculum and the education system that perpetuated segregation, inequality, and injustice. And as I hear this, I think of our own National Council on Reparations intervention with the Ministry of Education, where we have been speaking about how the narrative needs to change to sort of seal up some of the gaps in the colonial curriculum that has come handed down to us, which in many ways adds to the subconscious internalized racism that we practice against each other. So Dr. Moeng will probably be able to speak more to that, as she spent a number of years examining the effects of apartheid on their educational curriculum in South Africa. And if we are ready to go, Dr. Muki Moeng, welcome virtually to Jamaica. I hope it's as warm over there right now as it is here. We're going to turn you up in a moment for you to begin, and we're giving you 10 to 15 minutes, according to Ambassador. Good morning again. Is she ready to go? One sec, Dr. Moeng. Let's just confirm that the audio is up on your feed. Good to go, OCM? Good to go. Go ahead, Dr. Moen. Thank you.
Violence, pain, and suffering, I decided to structure my talk around three aspects, namely remembering, erasure, and forgetfulness.
Dr. Moeng, my apologies. 1 second. We're having a little technical difficulty. They're asking you to just pause a moment while they adjust the feed. You weren't coming in too clearly. And when we give you the signal. Okay. Can you give us a quick test? We're good. Go ahead, Dr. Moeng.
All right. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead with your presentation.
Okay. All right, thank you. Greetings to Her Excellency Ambassador Lumka Yengeni, the Honorable Olivia Grange, fellow panelists. There's an echo. Okay, I think I'm gonna just go ahead. It is my singular honor to be talking at such an important occasion. I am truly privileged to be part of such a historic initiative. Human Rights Day, Women's Historic Month, and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, all rooted in the Sharpeville massacre. As we commemorate a significant day in the history of our country, South Africa, which was punctuated by violence, pain, and suffering, I decided to structure my talk around three aspects, namely remembering, erasure, and forgetfulness. I am foregrounding this as a way that helps us to see how our looking back will assist us in looking and moving forward. When we commemorate, we often pause and reflect on our past, check where we are, and determine how we need to move forward. Today, we commemorate the tragic Sharpeville massacre of 1960, where 69 unarmed Black people were killed and more than 180 were wounded. A peaceful march against past laws was turned into a site of violence and anguish. Our forebears were fighting for basic human rights, equality, and social justice. In 1985, while commemorating the day in Udnake, 35 unarmed Black people were shot dead by the police. I'm reminded of this time as a 14-year-old in Graafrenet fighting against the state of emergency, where we fought for better education and the release of Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners. Townships were littered with police vans, special squads, yellow mellows, and hippos that were brought in to keep the peace, while they themselves were the perpetrators of violence. This torture and violence forced my brother into exile and myself into prison as a 15-year-old. Frantz Fanon gives an apt description of this kind of violence when he wrote his book, The Wretched of the Earth. He asserts that under oppression in the colonies, it is the policemen and soldiers who are the official, instituted go-between spokesperson of the oppressor and his rule of oppression. He further argued that in the colonial countries, the policemen and the soldiers, by their immediate presence and their frequent and direct action, maintain contact with the native and advise him by means of rifle butts and napalm. In that way, the language they spoke was that of pure force. Today, in the contemporary, I would like us to remember that as we commemorate, we are given the opportunity for identity formation that goes beyond the spectacle of memorial politics. We are called to make meaning of the past and invite a different historical sensibility that will allow us to move away from a traumatized suffering and injustice identity. We are called for democratic action, positive ideals of human self-realization and social emancipation. We are called to wake up from our slumber and work collectively towards a consciousness that Biko spoke about in his book, I Write What I Like. A consciousness that understands the institutionalized and systemic nature of racism and inequality. We therefore are obliged to change the narrative of reducing this day to a Braai Day. We have the responsibility to introduce curricula and critical pedagogies that conscientize the youth so that our history in its totality is not erased from our memories. History has taught us that it will be a confluence of strategies and ideas and intergenerational collaboration, interdisciplinarity, and interdependence that will help us to move forward in diversity, fighting against racism, inequality, and the scourge of gender-based violence. This interdependence speaks to what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie advises against in her talk about the danger of a single story. A single story that only paints a certain picture of the struggle. A story that makes it impossible for people to see the contribution of women, thereby denying their part in the struggle. We tend to forget to foreground women when we remember the struggle. It is therefore incumbent on us, when we remember the heroes of our struggle, we remember that women formed an integral part of that history. Nameless women who stood in the gap, like my mother, who fed, sheltered, and shielded those who were dodging bullets and were wanted by the Special Branch Police. Women who arranged for lawyers while their sons and husbands were imprisoned. Women who joined armed forces and went into exile. Women like Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and Anne-Sophie de Bruyn, who marched and led campaigns of defiance. We recognize that today women occupy powerful positions in parliament, in boardrooms, and in the community. We must, however, not forget how the majority of women still have to fight daily against poverty, gender-based violence, bullying, and marginalization in their homes, at work, and in their communities. We therefore must be careful not to erase others from history, as that is also a form of violence, violent silence. As I conclude, I am hopeful that as a collective, we will be able to systemically tackle racism, condemn it in its all forms, subtle and overt. As a collective, strategically fight poverty, inequality, and injustice. We therefore must invest in education, in job creation, and in our continued struggle for the public good. Therefore, let us not forget what brought us here to this point. Our democracy is still young. It is our duty and responsibility to build a nation that is proud to be South African and proud to be African. A nation that works towards a better cohesive collective. We must thus not take for granted the gains made thus far. We must not forget the pain and suffering that brought us up to this point. We must improve the living conditions of our people in tangible ways so that future generations can be proud of the legacy that we will leave behind. We are therefore obliged to make sure that future generations find this country and this world a better habitable place. They must say, our forefathers worked hard to leave behind an honorable legacy that will benefit generations to come. Thank you.
Insightful and speaking to how important it is, as Steve Biko said, to prevent the oppressors from wielding the greatest weapon against us, which is the minds of the oppressed, our very own minds. So very insightful. We're going to move along, but we thank you for those remarks. Up next, Dr. Lunga Mantashe, who is the Convocation President at the Walter Sisulu University. So first we had from the Nelson Mandela University, now from the Walter Sisulu University. I'm sure we all know those names, stalwart freedom fighters against apartheid, and so fitting that institutes of higher learning should be named after them. Dr. Mantashe is a Pan-Africanist and a lecturer at the University of Fort Hare. He's a former deputy president of the Pan-African Congress of Azania, the secretary for land affairs, and head of policy development in the party. He's also the former president of the Pan-Africanist Student Movement of Azania as a student wing of the PAC of Azania. He has participated in various dialogues on decolonization and belongs in the Fees Moscow movement, which threatened to redefine the education system of settler neo-colonial South Africa. Dr. Mantashe is also the president, I said earlier, for convocation at the Walter Sisulu University, and serves as much as he has served in the governance structures, institutional forum in the recent past, and currently as part of the Walter Sisulu University Council. As leader of convocation, he has recently launched and is leading a Walter Sisulu University Convocation fundraising initiative for the clearance of graduate debt. You know, Marcus Garvey, in his own Declaration of Rights, said that as African descendants who had been traumatized, whether by slavery or colonialism, that we should be entitled to free education for ourselves and our posterity forever. And he said that in 1920. So I still see Garveyism seeping through and into the hearts and minds of our brothers and sisters on the continent. So please welcome Dr. Mantashe. He's ready to go. Morning, sir. Good evening to you over there. Please go ahead. Let's do a quick sound check. Control booth, are you hearing him?
Good day.
Perfect.
Am I audible on the side? Okay. Looks like we have.
We're hearing you fine, sir. Go
Could
ahead,
I
Dr.
proceed
Mantashe.
then? All right. I'll assume that I'm audible. Thank you very much. Moderator, the fellow panelists, sons and daughters of the soil, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to cut to the chase in the interest of time, all protocol observed. Today in Azania, we commemorate the death of 69 people, and these 69 people, settler minority of white men who invaded and stole our land in 1652 onwards, and they still keep a big chunk of that land to date. For instance, they still own about 72% of commercial farmlands in South Africa today. About 50,000 white men own these farms. It is important to understand a little bit of an historical context to this day in order to appreciate this massacre that happened today and the events that happened thereafter. For indeed, Marcus Garvey is absolutely correct when he says that a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, is like a tree without roots. In 1912, the African National Congress, then South African Native Natal Congress, was formed. But at the time, it fought the national struggle passively through dialogue and petitions. For example, just at the beginning of the World War, the African National Congress was trying to petition the Queen to be able to deal fairly on the question of integration in South Africa. It was only in 1943 when the Congress Youth League was formed by young people, that even the language and radical. We were now at that time, 1943, not fighting to be included in a white man's parliament, which was formed in 1910, but to gain our exclusive right to our stolen land. The Congress of the ANC and was formed to stop the begging, but to introduce the defiance of imperialism, colonialism, racism, and apartheid in the fight for the right for self-determination, which Marcus Garvey so aptly speaks of. We started saying that Africa is for Africans because Europe is itself for Europeans, and so is China for the Chinese. So the first key program, which was introduced by these young radicals who were the Africanists in the 1940s, was introduced in 1952 as a defiance campaign, and it contained two tactics. One of these tactics was to deliberately engage in protest and in defiance campaigns. In doing elements of defiance was that whoever would be arrested would not require to be bailed, would not require to be defended by any lawyer, would simply stay in prison. But unfortunately, through the infiltration of the fake Communist Party at the time, some of these leaders were freed from jail by lawyers. And this on its own kind of undermined the efforts of the 1949 program of action, which was put together by the young radical Africanists in the early 40s. In the African National Congress, unfortunately, and other parties like the Communist Party and the Party of Indians gathered in Soweto, Cape Town, and declared that our country belonged to everybody, including the oppressors, the white men. They declared that South Africa belonged to all who lives in it, including the white man, the oppressor, the imperialist, as it were, the racist, even the colonizer. It was the same Africanists who formed the Congress Youth League in 1943 who disagreed with the so-called Freedom Charter and went on to form the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1959 as an authentic vanguard. The formation of this Pan-Africanist Congress in 1959 was a decisive factor in history because the latter called for an exclusive African organization led by Africans themselves to fight for the vital material, intellectual, and spiritual interests of Africans. Hardly a year after its formation, the PAC, as led by Robert Sobukwe, who is very little known in the world, launched a positive action campaign. Part of the first program of this positive action campaign would be the anti-pass campaign of March 1960. And this is where this campaign literally began. On 21 March 1960, Sobukwe had told the police and everybody else who were the apartheid regime that African people were going to be marching to the nearest police stations to hand themselves over, precisely because they were not going to be carrying their own dumb passes, and that they were going to be doing so peacefully. Then the police to behave appropriately under these circumstances. Unfortunately, the white men feared the march. The white men feared not only that people were trying to hand themselves over, the white men feared the psychological warfare that was embedded in this march. As a consequence, 63 men and women, children in Sharpeville and Langa were killed and they were massacred. 180 were injured. And 5 days after the massacre, the apartheid government told the world a big white lie. He said that the white man had acted in self-defense. He's carrying weapons. And it is Lieutenant Colonel Pinar who actually told the undiluted truth about the true intentions of the white man. He said, and I quote him here, if they, which is us, the black people, do these things, and by this, he meant the challenging of the apartheid colonial regime. He said, if they, black people, do these things, they must learn the hard way. And the hard way was violence. But fortunately, Sobukwe had anticipated that violence was going to come. And the Pan-Africanist Congress had warned people never to fear victimization, because he did indicate that the price of freedom was tears, toil, blood, and death. And so when the people, masses of the people had undergone that much, they had already accepted their fate, that their fate may be death, and they were psychologically ready. This is an important dimension about what had happened. And I must now indicate that the purpose of the march of 21 March was not to assert human rights per se, as it is ordinarily argued. If one reads the literature of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, one understands that the Don't Pass, the anti-pass campaign was part of a systematic methodical to challenge the colonial regime itself. It was not a fight for human rights, because a fight for human rights can never succeed without a fight for national liberation. The basis of human rights is national liberation, economic independence, and then you can have human rights. Basically, human rights are spin-offs of national liberation and liberation of the working classes against the colonial bourgeois forces. In fact, as I have said, that one cannot have a human right if their nation has been taken by invaders and settler colonists. Whatever rights we can enjoy will always be defined within the parameters of the oppressor, the white man's definition. Can only be established when the economic base which determines human relations has been in the hands of the Africans. To characterize what happened as a Human Rights Day is to speak, unfortunately, in abstraction. I'm saying this with all due respect to the speakers who have made this point, but it is to speak in abstraction and to distort not only history, but to prevent people from possessing any substantive memory, which the acting, Dr. Muki was talking about the day itself. Because if one wants to preserve memory, one has to preserve the exact set of circumstances, the exact labeling of the event. Because memory and keeping events the way they are with their authentic original names is not to forget what we should in fact remember. Because as Gavi has said, it's important to remember where we come from, because where we come from constitutes a root of who we are and where we're going. And so in so many ways, the government of today is doing no more than to perpetuate the destruction of memory by referring to this day as a Human Rights Day. And therefore, in South Africa, there is a debate about whether or not this concept of human rights should be kept as it stands, or we should go back to the concept of Sharpeville Langa Massacre Day. Because by calling this day Sharpeville Langa Massacre, we are able to draw correct parallels when such kinds of violence occur, even post-apartheid, as was the case with Marikana in 2012, when over 34 mine workers were killed again by white people, but unfortunately at that point in time, with the complicity of the government. So in another sense, the anti-pass campaign was a psychopolitical and ideopolitical strategy to force the confrontation between the antagonistic forces in order to increase the mental fighting capacity of the masses. As Gavi puts it, quote, of men, and ultimately you will liberate their bodies. And that was exactly the premise of Robert Sobukwe and the Pan-Africanist Congress when they spoke of this program. They said this was an unfolding positive action campaign which seeks, they called it a status campaign, because its intention was to free the mind. And his argument was, if you freed the mind, then you freed the body, an exact parallel to what Gavi had said. You will please remind me when my time is up, so I'm not able to eat much of your time. But the effect of 21 March 1960 is twofold. It's important to indicate this. Firstly, internally, first time armed struggle in People's Liberation Army and Umkhonto weSizwe being formed. Moreover, for the first time, these two political organizations, the PAC and the ANC, were pushed underground. And that's where these Umkhonto weSizwe for much of their time. Moreover, for the first time, Program Director, Robben Island was opened to keep political prisoners. Thirdly, death penalty became a direct response to intimidate the revolutionary fighters engaged in the war against settler minority. Hundreds of men were hanged in Pretoria in the 1960s as a consequence. And perhaps the most significant event that is very little known in the world is that there was then, for the first time, a law instituted against a man by the name Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who was also the leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania in 1959. This is the man who refused to come before the white man's court. Sobukwe refused to plead either guilty or not guilty in this foreign court with laws he did not help make, but laws made against him and the rest of African people. Represented by a lawyer, he was going to stay true to the initial strategy, and the strategy was this: no bail, no compromise. And the white man resented Sobukwe for this. And the white man also resented his vision. So the white man sat in parliament and made a law, a Sobukwe clause. Basically, this law, ladies and gentlemen, allowed the white man to keep Sobukwe in prison and in solitary confinement for as long as the white man wanted in order to serve his white interests. The white man also kept Sobukwe in solitary confinement because, as B.J. Foster, who later became the minister, was the Minister of Justice at the time, called Sobukwe a visionary who was a magnetic type, deserving never to be allowed to come closer to other human beings. The white man poisoned Robert Sobukwe with Robert Sobukwe's food, and his mental health deteriorated. The white man took Sobukwe out of Robben Island and put him under house arrest in Kimberley until he was dead in 1978, last month, that is on 27 February. Till today, as a consequence, Sobukwe's voice will never be heard because it was too powerful and feared by the white man. They had kept the tapes elsewhere, and nobody knows where those tapes are. Externally, settler minority became unpopular, as we all know. Its actions on March 1960 were declared a crime against humanity. The West did not want to openly associate with it, but we know for a fact that the United States did actually associate with the apartheid government. Quite frankly, the United States and the rest of the Western countries, International Monetary Fund, to give the apartheid government money. And this is what happened in 1976 as a consequence, that young people, students in basic education were brutally murdered by the weapons bought by money coming from the IMF, given to the apartheid government. So we know that in public, they didn't openly associate, constantly did, and that's what emboldened actually the apartheid government, which owned over 57% of the economy at that time. In conclusion, because I understand that I am now out of time, let me just rush to make the final point here. In so many ways, it could be said that the Pan-Africanist Congress achieved its goal. Its goal was to break down the fear for the white man, the fear for victimization, and the fear for death. And now the armed struggle could be formed with full man is not a man of peace. So we recalled Kwame Nkrumah when he said that those in power could never willingly give up that power. It must be made to do so by force. And that was the reason why there was an armed struggle. There must be a revolution. And as Che Guevara said, revolution is not like an apple that falls off the tree when the season is ripe. You have to make it fall. And the PAC and the rest of the liberation movements like the African National Congress had created the most decisive moment in history to make the apple fall. But he says more. He said that, Sobukwe said that let us be arrested and fill the white man's prison so that he, the white man, had nowhere to run. Sobukwe had a goal of crippling the white man's economy because he knew heavily on Africans for its continued existence. Sobukwe made a very vital a point of international significance. He said that the entire international finance capital rested on the shoulders of Africans, and that if Africans across the board revolted, the entire global capitalist, imperialist, racist system would fall on its knees. As a consequence, only the Africans can bring about liberation of all humanity, because only after the Africans have revolted, would including
We're losing you there, Dr. Mantashe. I know you were wrapping up though. Are we getting him back?
the working class.
Yeah, we're losing the feed. You're frozen. Okay. Dr. Mantashe? All right. That was Dr. Lunga Mantashe. I should, often as Africans in the diaspora, when we read the names of our continental brothers and sisters, we get a little intimidated, but I'm going to go for it, It's Dr. Lunga Olisa Mantashe. How I saw? Huh? For those of you in Jamaica who grew up in my generation, you should remember on Saturdays when they used to show that epic series, Shaka Zulu. And so all the Zulu words I learned in my childhood, I learned from the actor Henry Sele, and I would go to school saying things like, Kosi, I'm a Kosi, and I'm a Zulu, and Ndabezi, Baete, right? That is how much love we had here in Jamaica for Africa and things African, longing to be connected with our brothers and sisters on the continent. In fact, Ambassador, I understand that the television company Showtime has recently inked a deal to remake the Shaka Zulu series. So it is coming back for another generation on cable or on these different media platforms, and we look forward to that version. Before we wrap up, I do have to invite remarks, though, from a final guest, Professor Mzikaisi, yes, Binza, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and Research at the Walter Sisulu University. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Business and Management Sciences at Cape Peninsula University of Technology, CPUT. He has more than 20 years' experience in higher education and training and has worked for various universities in South Africa, where he held positions of director, professor, and program leader. He has published chapters in books and articles and is accredited and a peer-reviewed international and national journalist. He was a political commissar and special advisor to the Honorable Mr. Mahlaba during his time as Premier of the Eastern Cape Province in South Africa and Commissioner and Ambassador to Rwanda. He has served as policy advisor to ministers, premiers, executive mayors of the Democratic Party of South Africa on special programs. He's also a media commentator on issues of service delivery, political economy and liberation of Africa, conflict and transformation, the African peer review mechanism, governance, local government, diplomacy, and democracy. He wears many hats, even though he's not wearing one on our feed right now. But we are welcoming him here. Here in Jamaica, morning time, evening time in South Africa. And we invite his comments. You have about 10 minutes. Professor Binza, thank you for joining us. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. Good afternoon and good morning to our Honorable Ambassador, Comrade Lunga Yengeni, the President of Jamaica in absentia, the ministers that were presenting in this program, and the Jamaican government as host. A word of appreciation to my colleagues, to my countrymen, and Professor Moke from Nelson Mandela University, and Dr. Mantashe, President of Convocation of Francis University, and lecturer at the University of Water as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I think mine is not to repeat the speeches, but maybe to perhaps use a critical paradigm of looking at the speeches that were presented, and then also to use a distance lens to say what is it that we did so far since 1994, when our democracy ushered in. Are we, therefore, Comrade, Honorable Ambassador, your generation giving a very strong baton to the youth, so that they basically understand indeed the deepness and the profundity of what Professor Mugi from Nelson Mandela University, as well as Dr. Mangashe, is talking about, the psychological deepness and the psychological damage that was done by the policies of the former minority government before 1994. Stretching the surface, let me genesis as follows. One, we take note of a number of legislations that were passed by the minority government since it took over power in 1948. We can count a few, the Bantu Education of 1953, the Group Areas Act, the Homeland System, and all embedded in its policy of apartheid. And we all know what apartheid means. It basically means apartness, which means as races of in the country South Africa, which belonged to the minority at that time, taken from us, Black people, was that we will therefore have different spaces in our own land, though. So that was basically the painful paradox of the whole thing. I just want to select just few acts that really groomed or contributed to the grooming of the past generation, which is basically in power now. Understood, and we understand very well that many of the leaders in government fought against these legislation. And I will take a particular one, which is the Bantu Education Act of 1953. And I want us to basically understand the differentiation of the intelligentsia of the Africans in particular, and Black people in general, of the leaders who basically came up with or established the South African Native Congress of 1912. And these were the group of many Africans, and there was no PAC, AZAPO, ANC at that time. So, but these people decided that they are going to fight for the African, for the liberation of the Africans in particular, but Black people in general. And their caliber of intelligentsia and thinking was totally different from the intelligentsia of the current generation, if one puts it. Now, if all of us are in a university and we are sitting here today, have we really looked at what form of curriculum shaped that thinking of those leaders who established that vehicle of political liberation? And then we need, therefore, to also understand and think about the generation that, therefore, was shaped and groomed by the implementation of the Bantu Education Act of 1953. And if one thinks carefully and looks at this deeply, the comrades who just spoke and the leaders would basically look at, and in fact, they've actually quoted a number of sources in their speeches to basically indicate that there is something different. And I want us to, when we end this session, to basically think and take as a whole, because I'm not sure the age of the people in attendance in this meeting to say, but then obviously the Bantu education that was implemented in 1953 shaped a certain generation differently from the education that was implemented prior to that. yes, in post-1994, these kind of legislations were therefore appealed. There's no homeland system anymore. There's one South Africa. But many South Africans and Africans in particular, except maybe in government offices, are still holding those kind of slavery positions, which were basically designed by the type of education that they inherited or that actually formed them from the Bantu Education Act. So we have the Constitution, yes. So the point that I'm trying to bring in here is that what is it that our universities, our curriculum department, our university research departments are basically doing with the type of education? Those who are in the system of curriculum and quality assurance will basically agree, perhaps, with me to say we are still doing a renaissance of the same qualifications that were implemented in the Bantu education system. Whereas our universities have merged and transformed in name, having new names, etc., through mergers of the 2004, 2005. But the content that is given to our students and the current young generation is not different to a content of the curriculum given to the generation that actually absorbed the Bantu Education Act of 1993. So I think my quest will be to say we need to do something very much differently and take these kind of opportunities given to us by the Jamaican government as well as the South African Embassy in Jamaica, the Honorable Ambassador Longwa Yenge. The second part is that, yes, we all agree that until post-1994, that the type of beneficiation of the liberation movements and the liberation struggle is that of political, not economic. So now we need to basically to look at to what extent can we therefore ensure that the Africans in particular and the Black people in general are really benefiting and taking over the means of production. To what extent are we therefore saying to the workers, you know what, you can be a worker in a factory, but you are therefore a leader. And can that kind of paradigm shift in a company that has too many white people and who have been in the system as managers, in particular, let's talk about the banks, in a sense. So can that basically happen when an African who is, who's shaped by this type of education that we're actually talking about, really be considered as a true leader, except sucking up power, if I may put it that way. So, and how many of these particular Africans have really became sort of wealthy men and be in charge of recreating the economy? And what model or paradigm can we talk about that is really of African that can own the means of production? There are opportunities, yes. There are opportunities. Is our government ready in a sense that of planting too many resources for these African people to own in a sustainable way and have success in changing the economic paradigm of our democracy and become the pioneers in these economic means? So I think we basically need to be looking at that now, because we are counting years and decades of democracy. And yes, of course, these years are basically increasing. But if we therefore use different lenses, academic lenses, therefore we will actually take note, even practical lenses, will basically take note that the unemployment rate is actually increasing as well. And who are these people who are in majority unemployed in a democratic country that Sobukwe, Mandela, and Jamavu, and many, including the Honorable Lunga Yegi, the people who fought for this democracy that we have. You know, how many of these Africans are actually unemployed? What can be done? You know, because that's what we are basically looking for. Is it necessary for us Africans to fight by way of protesting against the same government, let's say that government? Why not the same government who's black came into power through democratic means can seriously lead with honesty and transparency to make sure that the things that are challenged in protest are no more from now going forward? To me, that will be a type of the beneficiations that those 69 or people who lost their lives during the Sharpeville massacre, you know, have us benefiting from the democracy that we have today. Those people who were injured, and those people who went to the barracks, you know, in different countries in the liberation movement, you know, at least they will basically appreciate the fact that now the black people are owning the economy. They are very much competent, highly respected by the peoples of the world. And their education system, there are programs, new programs, that the black vice chancellors in these universities have came up with that are basically putting the universities in South Africa and in Africa ahead of the curve. You understand? So, and these universities in Africa are basically leading the generation of knowledge. Currently, if we talk about that kind of synopsis of education, the African universities are still far. We have only one that is actually in between 100 universities to 200 universities in the world. That would be UCT. The rest are not. What can we do there? What can we do? What can we do in taking the lessons learned from the previous generations who are not educated in the Bantu education system, but in a different education prior to the implementation of that? How can we therefore recall that type of education that those leaders who liberated us were built from, so that we can be maybe like them? We can be fearless, like Sobukwe, as Dr. Madash is saying. We can be fearless, like Mr. Mandela, as Professor Moki was actually talking about, and challenge our own problems and convert the problems into solutions. So my chair would be basically that we need to be thinking differently. We need to be taking over now the economy. We need to be taking over the production of the intelligentsia for the future of Africa and for the future of Jamaica. And I do appreciate the program. I do appreciate the input from my colleagues. And Honorable Ambassador Lunga Yengini, thank you for this wonderful opportunity. We now have sisters and brothers in Jamaica who suffered the same way in like South Africa in liberating their own country. On that note, I thank you.
And we thank you, Professor Mzikaisi Binza, for his remarks there, and indeed all our guests who joined us via Zoom from South Africa, Dr. Lunga Mantashe and Professor Muki Moeng. Thank them all. The rose in between the thorns. So we have to big up the female presenter in Women's History Month. We're coming to the end of the program, and we are streaming live at PBCJ YouTube channel, and also on Vimeo through JIS. And so we know the media is hearing us. Before we close up, I do want to invite the first secretary, the first political secretary here at the South African High Commission, Mr. Nkangweni Siliga, who will move for the vote of thanks, after which we will be closing off this press conference. So please welcome Mr. Siliga to the podium.
Thank you very much, our moderator, Mr. Stephen Golding. It is an honor and privilege for me to be giving you the vote of thanks today on this special occasion wherein we celebrate the Human Rights Day and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Both days were shaped by the events that happened in South Africa, the Sharpeville massacre. I would also want to extend special appreciation to the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports, and also to the representative of the Minister, Olivia Grange, of the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports, Ms. Davis Mattis, who is also the chairperson of National Council on Reparation. Also, special appreciations to our academics who have joined us from South Africa, who link the events of today and provided their own historical perspective, linking the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and also giving us perspective, and especially in relation to the roles that were played by women during these events that normally are not really recognized. In that regard, I also want to extend our humble appreciation to the team that assisted us to have this function went live, seen all over the world. And then with those few words, I will invite everyone for a networking opportunity after the event in a separate room. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Siliga. And on behalf of the National Council on Reparation, the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports, on behalf of our Honorable Minister, also, we do again want to extend our sincere thanks to the South African High Commission for hosting this event and for doing it jointly with the Ministry's National Council on Reparations. It's an important day, Human Rights Day in South Africa, International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and it just speaks so much how, as the first family of the earth, as the oldest branch of the human race, Africans are at the center of any of the major developments within the world history and civilization. And certainly the issue of human rights is one that we have raised the call for and have been an example of the spirit of resilience and the ability to overcome and the strength of a people in all that we have faced as Africans, both at home and abroad. And so we mark this day with reverence, with remembrance for the sacrifices of our ancestors, both here and on the continent, and for the hard-fought lessons that we have had to teach the world through our own periods of suffering and of overcoming at great obstacle the monsters that have been created in the minds of men through the institutionalization of slavery, through colonization, and through racial discrimination embodied in such brutal systems such as apartheid that was faced by the South Africans for so many decades. before their own liberation. So again, Ambassador Yengeni, thank you. Our chair, Ms. Lalita Davis Mattis, thank you. To the hardworking team at the ministry, our Director of Culture, Joanne Archibald, Special Advisor, Mr. Sid Bartley, and others, the team at OCM, at PBCJ, at JIS, who worked tirelessly through the night to put this event together so that we could make our voice be heard around the globe on this special day. To our own Professor Vereen Shepherd, who right now is addressing the General Assembly at the United Nations on the occasion of this day, with the theme looking at, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the impetus to combat racism, which is being pronounced loudly, I'm sure, in her own words, in New York City right now at the General Assembly of the United Nations. Not forgetting our own first national hero, because while it is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is the 102nd anniversary this year of the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World that was proffered by the UNIA's first convention in 1920, chaired by the Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and which predated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by some 28 years, right? And as I opened with earlier, the record shows that the Native Lands Acts, the past laws, the same past laws that were protested at the Sharpeville massacre or led to the Sharpeville massacre, were raised as early as 1928 at the League of Nations by our own national heroes. So we love the synergy. It goes way beyond us watching Shaka Zulu. It goes back to the fact that our energies, our spirit have fed into each other, have lifted each other at various times throughout our history, and the relationship between Jamaica and South Africa, Your Excellency, is one that we value highly. So thank you all tuning in on the web, to the media houses who have been following us since 10 o'clock this morning. We charge you with announcing to the world the significance and importance of this International Day of Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is celebrated as Human Rights in South Africa. I end now with the immortal words of our first national hero, the motto of the UNIA: one God, one aim, one destiny. Thank you all.